Welcome to Best Practices in Technology Training. We're going to explore some very simple tools, tips, and strategies to make our technology trainings more effective. We're going to begin by talking about session framework and the importance of having a session framework during technology trainings. We're also going to talk about the sequence of information and always remembering to start with the big picture first. We're going to then get into how we can allow our participants to create meaning from their technology training experience. And finally, we're going to just close with a reminder to always encourage exploration and creativity. It is very important to frame your technology training for your participants. There should be a very clear beginning, middle, and end framework with different procedures at the beginning, middle, and end. In the beginning, of course, this is the first beginning tool we're going to talk about, and that is to make the objectives clear, to always let the learner know what they will learn, how they will learn, and why they will learn. And this goes back to best practices in adult learning theory, and the adults need to know. Below in blue, you will see there's a quick introduction that covers the what, the how, and the why of an introductory Photoshop session. And you can pause this video for a moment and read through it and think about how you would perhaps modify this or how you could use this type of introduction to meet your needs. But again, it needs to be very clear to the participants what they were doing and how they were doing and why they were doing it. And the why should always link back to a larger application, some type of classroom or practical application. Another effective tool to implement at the beginning of your product training is to provide participants with an agenda of the session and frame the content sections into questions. So we saw this similar technique in the Introduction to Photoshop video that we saw in week 1 of the course. But rather than introduce the content in a very blunt way, it's very helpful to the learner if you just place it into questions and then revisit these questions as you progress throughout the training. And there's the three examples of just some very simple questions, and it just helps to keep the learner oriented to where you are within the training, and they'll also know what's coming next, and they feel somewhat more relaxed and at ease knowing what's going to come at them, and it gives them the questions also serve as an organizing principle. It gives them something to place all the different skills and functionalities into a little bit of a larger picture. Another good practice to implement at the beginning of your session to make sure it's clearly framed for your participant is to make sure that you provide a bulleted list, or at least to say out to them the functionalities that you're going to cover. Be very explicit. Let them know ahead of time what's coming at them, along with the session objectives and an agenda of what's going to happen. Let them know very explicitly up front, we're going to cover A, B, C, and D functionalities, and this is what they do, and you'll see more about this in a minute. In the middle of your product training, that's where most of the new information is going to be introduced. And just make sure that throughout this middle part of the training that you're always revisiting the framework that you set up in the beginning, that you're revisiting the session questions throughout. We're moving on to the second question. We're moving on to the third question. Make transitions between one skill to another clear to participants. We covered how to crop a photo. Now we're going to move on to layering, for example, and make sure that they are aware of where you are in the session agenda at all times. We want to make sure that we include a very strong ending framework for our participants as well. We want to summarize the objectives that we covered, revisit session questions, and review the functionalities that were introduced. Creating a framework around your learning is not just best practices for technology training, but it is especially important to do in technology trainings. Oftentimes our participants are not very comfortable with technology. Providing them with this framework puts them at ease and lets them know what's going to happen next and how their session's going to flow. It also helps them to place the new skills and knowledge that you're introducing into a larger framework, and that helps them to retain knowledge. This framework serves as a bit of an organizing principle for them. So it's not just good practice for technology training, but it is especially good practice for technology training, and it's often forgotten in technology training. Oftentimes trainers just jump right into the functionalities without providing a larger picture or without wrapping those skills into a larger framework. We're going to move on from creating a framework and talk about the sequence of information that you're introducing to your participants. And we want to remember to always start with the big picture first. So what does that mean? Well, we want to avoid the Too often practice of just jumping right into, here's a functionality, here's a specific functionality, and let's start from there as the beginning of our session. We really want to avoid that. When you're introducing a new product, it's very important to start with the largest picture first, and one way to do that is just to demonstrate the product's real-world application. What is this product's capabilities? What can it do? How is it used in the real world? Start to create a larger picture for your audience. Then once they have an idea of the big picture of this for this product, then you can take it down a notch and show them this is how students are using this product. Here's some of their work. Here's you could show them the final product for the activity that you may be doing with them in your session, but you want to just take it down a notch from the real world application, the largest application. Now here's a classroom application. Here's how what we can do within our classroom. And then once they have that picture in their head, then you bring it down and show them the user interface. Make sure that they are oriented to the user interface before you drilling and introducing specific functionalities. Make sure they understand what's happening in the top toolbar, the left toolbar, the right toolbar. They feel somewhat comfortable and they've had a minute they can somewhat navigate around and understand what's where. And once that happens, then the last thing to introduce them is any specific functionality. Um, Too often, trainers start with one functionality and then work their way around that, but we want to avoid doing that. You always want to talk about the product's capabilities in the real world, then what it can do for students in a classroom. Make sure you orient them to the user interface and then dive into the functionalities. The third best practice in product technology training that we're going to talk about is allowing participants to create meaning from experience. So what don't we want to do? We do not want to give a lot of direct instruction. We want to minimize the amount of direct instruction that we're giving participants. We do not want to be showing them and talking to them and modeling for them the entire session. We want to minimize that. If a good rule of thumb, if it's an hour professional development session, 15 minutes of that should be giving instruction at the most. The other time, the other minutes, the other 45 minutes should be spent with the participants engaged, doing, trying, experimenting, exploring, making mistakes, asking questions, engaged in some task, creating some project. We want to avoid at all costs the I show you do model of product training. This is probably the most ineffective model. We don't want this to happen. Um, it works in that moment when you're showing a participant a particular functionality and they can repeat it, but they're not going to remember it if they don't have an opportunity to apply it to a larger task. So you want to show them up front how to do something, and then you want to let them go and do it on their own. So what do we want to do? We want to model functionalities and then quickly engage the participants in a larger task. Show them the functionalities that they need to edit a image and then let them go ahead and edit that image. Give them a large amount of time to edit that image and try different things, try it out. Allow them to work with each other and ask each other questions as they're learning. Partner beginner level users with someone with more skill to help coach, circulate around the room, and guide participants when needed. So the idea is to give them, introduce to them the skills and functionalities that they would need to create a task, do that in the smallest amount of time possible, quickly model for them, and then let them do it. Let them try it, engage in a task, making mistakes, fixing their own mistakes, asking each other for help, while you circulate the room and answer questions when you can. So our last best practice that we're going to talk about is encouraging exploration and creativity. Always encourage educators in your sessions to explore the technology. Let them know that there are no mistakes. Let them know that they can create something and we can delete it later or fix it later. They're not going to break anything. Encourage them to be creative and add their own spin. And encourage discussion, sharing of ideas, strategies, tools, and tips. Encourage problem solving around your participants as well. So we talked about four very simple techniques that we can incorporate in our product trainings. The first is providing a very strong framework, a beginning, middle, and end to wrap around your session. We talked about how to introduce information to participants, starting with the biggest picture first. What are the product's capabilities? We'll start with the real world application, going to classroom application, making sure they're comfortable with the user interface, and then getting into specific functionalities. We also talked about making or allowing our participants to make meaning from experience and letting them dive into the product, use it, avoiding the practice of the facilitator, the trainer, speaking to them the whole time, or showing them a functionality and having them repeat it and back and forth ping-ponging. That way, we don't want to do that. We want to upfront introduce some skills for them and then let them go ahead and engage them in a task and allow them to apply those skills and so that they're using those skills, and then that way they're going to retain those skills. And lastly, we just always want to remember to encourage exploration and creativity. Let them know that they can have fun, nothing's going to happen, and let them see that this is a fun product and tool that they can use, they can master, and they can begin to apply it to their classroom.